Hello and welcome back to another episode of Thoughts. My name is Jasmine.
And my name is Alex.
And today we have a very special episode in which we'll be discussing all things dissertations with Dr. Emma Gordon, who's been voted Best Dissertation Supervisor within Glasgow University last year. So here are some thoughts on dissertations.
Right, so Emma, welcome on the podcast. Thank you for being here. It's a great pleasure and honor to have you. Let's start by asking who you are, what are you doing at the university, and how do you view this topic of dissertations? Because me and Jasmine, as third-year students who are about to embark on this journey, may be too anxious to learn.
Yeah, it's a vanity project, really.
Well, I'm a research fellow in philosophy here at Glasgow Uni. I'm working on a project called the Virtue Epistemology of Trust. My background is in epistemology, but more recently I've started to work on bioethics, especially the ethics of new drugs and technologies like cognitive enhancement drugs and brain chips and all these kinds of ways of augmenting ourselves and our personalities. And I'm currently doing a fourth-year class on this. So a lot of the dissertations I supervise are in that area. In terms of today, I think so I can describe some things that have gone well in my experience and some things I've learned from working with students. But I would say that part of dissertation supervision is about finding a kind of equilibrium with your particular supervisor, and that's going to look slightly different every time, which means that I don't want to be offering some kind of prescription for one way to do a dissertation well, but rather just some things from my experience that you might find useful.
That sounds amazing. Let's just do a disclaimer on our part as well, that being third-year students and having no idea what a dissertation is, we don't really know. This is not meant to be a guide for how we as students choose what to do within the university. This is just meant to be an informative session and an informative discussion with Emma. So I think, Emma, let's begin the real discussion of today's episode with the discussion about topic. So how do we as students decide what a topic is? Should it be specific? Should it be very general?
So I think in terms of deciding on a topic, one thing that's really helpful during your year's courses is just to note down things that interest you. So things that aren't overlapping with the coursework you submit, but that you're curious about or that you find exciting. And this will give you kind of a bank of things that you could develop in a dissertation. It also gives you a good start in the relevant literature, I think. And from there, when you start to think that you might be interested in something, there are lots of great resources like Phil Papers, where you can just search for specific philosophers whose work you've enjoyed or specific topics you're interested in, and then start to get into the question of what you might work on in a bit more depth. It's also true that if you search for philosophers that who have written work that you've liked in the past, you'll often find their draft work, which they haven't even published yet, which means that your dissertation could be on something that is just an emerging topic in the literature. So that's one way you can start thinking about a topic. In terms of how you get first, I think there is a popular rumor that you need to have like this groundbreaking idea in order to do well. And it's a myth, I think, that you need to make a massive contribution to the literature to do well in the dissertation. So maybe, for example, you might worry that you won't get a good grade unless you come up with some new theory of knowledge, or if you're in philosophy of mind, unless you solve the mind-body problem or something like that. But the dissertation's actually pretty short. It's just 5,000 to 8,000 words. And so it's really often better to keep the focus pretty narrowed, which means you can be original in the way that we would like to see, but that you don't have to do something massive in order to do well. So basically what I'm suggesting is that you might want to make a careful and modest point rather than proposing some grand view that's difficult to support in the space. Basically, good dissertations will take a stance and advance a debate, but the way in which you advance that debate doesn't have to be massive at all. You might just offer a new counterexample, say, to a particular view that's established in the literature, or maybe you could add a new condition to someone else's view, or offer some new defense of a view that has been attacked elsewhere in the literature. So there are all sorts of small ways to make a contribution, and all of those can result in a really good grade.
So you mentioned that the dissertations for philosophy are roughly 5,000 to 8,000 words, which seems like a much smaller number than my friends who are in history or English. They have a huge number of words to do. Would the recommended structure then be to kind of treat it as multiple 2,000 word essays, for example, and have sort of an overarching theme, or is there a specific way you would expect to have a dissertation structured, or can you sort of do a brain splurge, come back to it, and then do it afterwards? Is that the best way to go about it?
I actually think it's helpful to think about it as a big essay, essentially. So I was chatting with Adam Rieger, who is the head of senior honours currently, and he was agreeing on this point that basically it's a massive essay, or well, a bigger essay. The main difference, other than length, is really just that you set your own question. Structurally, it's going to look very similar to what you do for your essays, in that you're going to have some introductory component, an expository bit, a critical part. Really, it will all look the same. And I think with respect to your question about length, I think the fact that it is shorter reflects the way in which we want to encourage you to be really clear and really pithy in your writing. So we want you to get sort of straight to the point and argue for the stance that you want to take.
It might be worth talking about choosing the topic a little bit more and tailoring the question, because I know how once you find something you're interested in, how the hell do you go about refining that into an articulate question which feels like an official one? You read all of these like philosophical papers and they're really good, strong questions and titles. So how would you recommend going about refining your dissertation title?
Well, I would say for a start that you can always reach out to people in the department to talk about your ideas and to talk about how you might refine a question. In terms of how to set your own question, I think that two sources of inspiration are previous essay questions. So look at the questions you've answered on the courses that you've done, and think about how those are structured and see if you can mirror that structure for yourself in the question that you set. And another potential source of inspiration is the sort of structure of paper titles as well, in journals that have a similar length to the dissertation project. And you'll quickly start to get a feel for the way in which these titles are often structured, and you can just kind of, I think, play around with how you might want to structure yours. But yes, a good starting point, I would say, is just the way that lecturers set out the essay question titles, especially in your honours years, and see how you can use that rough structure to delineate something you want to work on.
And how much feedback do you then get from your supervisor with regard to the topic and with regard to choosing the question?
So at the time that you propose your question, you won't have a supervisor. So that will be just the stage at which you submit your idea. And I would say that it's normal to refine your idea as you're working. So when you submit your proposed question or your proposed title, it needs to be in the ballpark of what you want to work on so that you can be assigned an appropriate supervisor. But it is fine for you to make tweaks to that later. Once you have a relationship up and running with your supervisor, that can be one of the first things that you talk about if you would like to, or you can check in as you go through that the question that you're working towards really reflects the stance that you're developing. So there's some flexibility in the question once you set it. So I wouldn't get too anxious about the original formulation of it, if that makes sense.
That's a good thing to note, that the first thing you come up with doesn't have to be the thing which you're stuck with throughout.
I would say that the broad topic is one that you should stick to because it determines who you work with. So say if you submit an idea that's in philosophy of mind and you get paired with a philosopher of mind and then you move to an ethics project, you won't have the best supervisory fit that you could. But the precise formulation of the question, it's very normal for that to change and evolve, including in some cases for people's stances to flip from defending a view to attacking it. So that's all perfectly normal and not to be worried about too much.
So to return to supervisory fit then, what's the deal with getting a supervisor? Do they have to be an expert in the topic, or because there seems to be a finite number of supervisors in the department and 1 million students. So how does that work?
So as I understand it, though it's always worth checking the latest guidelines on the Moodle about this, you can state a preference for a supervisor or a suggestion for who might be a good fit for your topic. But as you pointed out, there are often supervisors who are in great demand because of certain classes that they've run. So there is a good chance that you won't get the person that you name as your desired supervisor. What I would say about that is that although it's natural to find that disappointing, everyone in the department is very well placed to supervise pretty much any project. We've all been rotated around to teach different classes. I've taught a Kant class before, which is really far outside of my wheelhouse. So really we have a lot of experience even in the things that we don't research in our free time. And also I would add that in my first year at Glasgow, none of my supervisees had asked for me because they didn't know me. And yet we had a really good experience with all the people I was matched with. We ended up working really well and developing good relationships. So I was a disappointment to all of them, and yet it worked out well. So I would say that although the initial feeling can be one of, oh, I really wanted to work with that person, there's always something to learn from pretty much anyone you could work with. And everyone in the department will be, I think, well experienced in your topic anyway.
Right. So in the years you've been at the university, in the years you've known students doing dissertations, from the areas within philosophy, which has been the one that you have most encounters with?
So I was originally hired to take some ethics classes, which means it's most common for me to get ethics students, even though I have a background in epistemology. I will say I sometimes get students who take their topics from my contemporary ethics class, which means that the topics I most commonly encounter now are ones about human enhancement technology. But even saying that, I've never supervised two dissertations that I would say are even remotely alike. I've had everything from reproductive rights to euthanasia, to a new version of the trolley problem. I'd say every dissertation has been dramatically different from the last, but broadly construed, it's ethics that I tend to get the most often.
That's very interesting. So I guess the next logical question would be, within the dissertations that you've encountered, what's the most common either misconception on the part of the student, or I don't want to say mistake because that might be too strong, but what's the most common mishap in the behavior of or critical thinking of the students?
I would say it's probably feeling disempowered to begin. So it's very common to think I have to read everything about this topic before I put anything down in a Word document, or to think this is my big chance to make a contribution. And both of those types of ways of thinking, I think, can be really disempowering. It's helpful to remember that the dissertation doesn't have to be your last word on a topic, especially if you're considering going on to do a master's and maybe a PhD. And try to remember too that you don't have to say everything that's important about a topic or everything that's true about a topic in your dissertation. If you start early and you have a lot of rough material, I think that ends up being very useful too, because you can edit it down and figure out what the narrow point you want to make actually looks like in its best form. So yeah, I would say really the most common kind of mishap is associated with people feeling like they just can't start to write. And yeah, as a supervisor, I try and normalize that feeling and make sure students know it's absolutely fine to send drafty material that they're not sure about, rather than just the polished things that they would absolutely stand by.
So if students are feeling sort of disempowered, if that's like the main issue, what would you recommend to someone who's maybe not even in third year, maybe in first or second year, who's panicking about this big fat essay at the end of the year? What would you say they can do to sort of make the process easier right at the beginning of the process?
Well, one thing again is to remember that you're gaining the skills all the time to do the dissertation, because it really just is like a large essay. So every time you write an essay and hand one in, you're refining the exact skill set that you'll be using in fourth year to do your dissertation. If you feel like you're early in your degree and you want to already start thinking about what you might want to work on, I'd suggest keeping kind of a list of ideas of things that interest you as they come up in lectures and in seminars. So these might be things you're not asked to answer in your essays, but which capture your imagination or your interest. And then you can have kind of a bank of those that you come back to when you actually submit your proposal. That's one way to start preparing early. although I would say that a lot of students don't encounter the subject that they really want to work on or don't realise they've encountered it until perhaps third year, when the classes become more specialised. But really, there's no time that's too early if you want to start thinking about topics. Although I would add that there's no pressure to do that, and I don't think anyone I've worked with has prepared as early as first and second year. So I don't want to sort of normalise that as something you have to do in order to do well.
So I would feel that if I was to write a dissertation on the theory of knowledge, then I'd have to really get in there and help with the contemporary field in some original way. And maybe that's not very helpful in writing a dissertation. So could you explain maybe more to that end?
So I would say you absolutely don't need to be familiar with everything in a contemporary debate in order to write a good dissertation. It's very normal and understandable to feel anxiety about the dissertation because it looks different at first to the things that you've done already. And students sometimes feel actually that the word count looks really large and that they can't imagine filling up that space. And usually they find that once they start writing, the space fills up really quickly. So I think, yes, it's very normal to feel anxious about it at first, but if you, as I've said previously, treat it as a big essay, I think it starts to feel more manageable. In terms of what you were saying about being familiar with everything in the contemporary debate, I would reiterate that students really just need to make a narrow contribution in order to do something significant. And I'd actually dissuade, I think, students from trying to do something enormous like a new theory of knowledge, because it's very difficult to do that well within the confines of 5,000 to 8,000 words. Whereas it's very possible to mount a new counterexample or add a new condition in a very clear and very precise way within the word count.
So I'd quite like to talk about the sort of time frame for dissertations, because as a third year, I have absolutely no clue about this, but I've also done no research into it. So there is probably some good material out there which I could have read beforehand. But what is the general time frame for dissertations? When do I have to have decided on a topic? And when roughly will I have to hand it in?
Question. So you can certainly start coming up with ideas as early as you want. So there's no prescribed time frame for that. The most recent group, the deadline for submitting a proposal, I think, is July 2nd. So you can probably expect something like that in most years. And then your submission for the dissertation would be near the end of whichever term you choose. So it's up to you to decide if you want to do your dissertation in semester 1 or semester 2. And that's a decision that people often make based on which classes they would want to take in semesters 1 or 2, because taking the dissertation module means taking only 2 classes with lectures in the semester that you choose. So that sometimes influences the time frame that people choose. I would say as well that everybody should check out the dissertation Moodle fairly regularly, because Dr. Gary Kemp will make edits and add deadlines as they come up. So this should be really easy information to find, but if it isn't, it's absolutely fine for you to drop Gary a line, or for you to drop Dr. Adam Rieger a line and ask about something that you couldn't find on Moodle. But usually the time frame, I think, is you submit your original idea sometime around the beginning of July, I think.
So for students who are neurodivergent, for dyslexics and people with ADHD, what extra help can the department provide? Because I know that I'm dyslexic, and the thought of writing a big essay brings me out in a cold sweat. So what kind of support can the department provide?
So I spoke with our senior honours convener about this recently, and some students' disability records will explicitly mention something like flexibility with deadlines, whereas others don't necessarily have that. But in any case, whether it's on your record or not, the senior honours convener will try to do what they can to help. The rules here aren't really different from any other piece of coursework you'll have done for philosophy. So if you want to have special arrangements with your supervisor about how you approach feedback, say, for example, it's easier or better for you to process feedback in a face-to-face meeting or an email, I would encourage you to just raise that with your supervisor for discussion and negotiate it quite early in your relationship with them. So perhaps the first time you meet, And that is, again, a thing that dissertation supervisors encounter all the time. There's nothing unusual about us being asked that. So it's absolutely fine for you to raise that with your supervisor. And anything to do with extensions or extended deadlines, that's always the purview of the senior honours convener. And that will work just as it does for your essays.
So then what can a student expect from their supervisor, and what can the student bring to meetings and bring to their emails to get the best out of this relationship?
So I think it can be really helpful to explicitly discuss expectations and any questions about expectations with your supervisor really near the beginning. So have a discussion about how often you will meet, what your dissertation supervisor is able to offer you in terms of reading and commenting on material, whether there are particular kinds of conversations you'd rather have via email versus via Zoom or face-to-face. And it's important too to check out with your supervisor how much notice they would need in order to read something before a meeting, for example. So I would say to start the relationship on the best foot, basically just explicitly raise these kinds of things for discussion so that you know where you are with each other. And that tends to make the process run a lot more smoothly, I think. Yeah, that it's the most important thing is probably to be on the same page about what's happening. Again, it's really normal to ask questions about expectations you might have, so don't worry that that's something that you should know already. And I think it's this kind of clarity and this sort of groundwork that is most likely to establish a good foundation with whoever you're working with, no matter what your specific topic might be.
So if you're doing joint honours, how much are you allowed to overlap your topics in your dissertation? Do you have to, say you're doing history of art and philosophy, do you have to do a dissertation in philosophy, or could you do aesthetics of art or something like that?
So the first thing I'd say about this is you do have to choose a department within which you want to do the dissertation. So you commit to doing a philosophy dissertation or a history of art dissertation. If you want to do your dissertation in the philosophy department, then what you submit will be evaluated as a piece of philosophy. So really what I would say about the potential for overlap is if you think you have a philosophical point to make that draws on something from your other subject, see what your supervisor thinks about this and talk together about how you can make sure this is still a piece of philosophy, even though it draws from something in psychology or economics or history of art. So it is possible, but I would say that it's an area in which you need to be quite careful that what you hand in is still something in which you take a clear stance and rigorously argue for that stance. It's easy if you kind of mix your subjects together to accidentally submit something that's maybe more expository than it is an argument. And I think the key kind of take home point is just if you're doing a dissertation in philosophy, it has to be a piece of philosophy, and that might well be a piece of philosophy that draws on something in the history of art, but it can't be how you would formulate a dissertation in the history of art if it's done under the umbrella of philosophy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Right. So for students who are interested in a career within philosophy, so within the academic field of philosophy, what are the possible ramifications from the dissertation?
If you're going to continue in philosophy, you generally don't have to start thinking very much about publications until you're a PhD student. And before you're a PhD student, you'll be a master's student. So during that time, your skills will be refined even further than they were at your senior honours level. This means you're unlikely by the time you try to publish material to be focusing on material you produced in fourth year, because you're likely to be happier with what you produced during your master's year. That said, sometimes dissertations are the foundation for a piece of work you might do in your master's, which may then become your research field of interest. So you may find later down the line you draw on bits and pieces from your dissertation, but for most people, what they choose to try and get published for the first time will be something that they've done in their master's or beyond.
So if you had one thing that people should take away from this episode, what would it be?
I think it would just be that the dissertation is really a big essay. It's not something mysterious or scary. It is really just more of what you've done in a larger amount of space. So a key message, I think, is that students really have all the skills that they need by the time they get to the dissertation stage. And it's helpful, I think, to remind yourself of that when anxiety comes up around the dissertation. We've really been trying to help you prepare for the dissertation during your degree, and every time you write an essay, you're refining the skills that you need. So yes, it's really a big essay, and you'll know what you're doing, I think, once you start writing.
Thank you. That's a really good piece of advice. Don't panic. Don't freak out. It'll all be fine.
Right. Well, this has been great. Emma, thank you for being on the podcast. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
It's been really good. Thank you. Thank you for joining us on today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it.
And remember, you can find us on social media, on Facebook under Thoughts U of G, on Twitter under the same name, and on Instagram under Thoughts_U of G. See everybody next time.